did Jesus exist? It's actually a tougher question than most people think. So I begin with quoting an ancient document. This is an ancient document, I quote. "On the day before the Passover, they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days, proclaiming, 'He will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him.' But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before the Passover." That's what the Talmud says. If any of you know how the story goes in the New Testament, you might notice the two accounts don't exactly agree. Here, Jesus is stoned, not crucified, and by Jews, not Romans, and was in custody for 40 days, not over a single night. And he was executed for sorcery and enticing people to follow other gods, not for blasphemy. And yet, that passage is really the best evidence for Jesus that we have outside the New Testament, and it comes only centuries later. So you either have to conclude that there is no reliable evidence outside the New Testament, or that the New Testament itself is full of shit. Now granted, there are earlier references, but they aren't any good. They either just repeat what Christians were telling them, Christians who were just riffing on the New Testament, or they are actually fabricated by Christians themselves. And the most famous example is a whole paragraph in the early Jewish historian Josephus, which nearly everybody agrees was snuck into that book by a later Christian scribe, who was evidently annoyed that Josephus forgot to mention Jesus. So when he copied the book out, he made sure to, just add a paragraph. You generally don't have to add paragraphs to other people's history books for a guy who actually existed. Pretty much if you're inserting a guy into history who wasn't there before, usually that means he really wasn't there before. Now that leaves us just with the New Testament. In that, the oldest books are the epistles, or some of the epistles. They don't really tell us anything about Jesus. So the epistles are no good. I move on. What do we have left? Well, the Gospels. But those tell stories about a God-man who teaches lessons, goes on adventures, suffers a terrible death, and then rises from the grave to become a god, which is actually a story that had already been told a dozen times already. It was actually more popular a story than television crime dramas are now. If they had TV back then, instead of 10 different spin-offs of Law and Order, you'd see 10 different spin-offs of Son of God. A typical TV guide entry would read like this: "Yet another resurrected Son of God tells people to get their shit together and is killed for his trouble, but rises from the grave and ascends to heaven to get his future revenge on their mortal souls." There would have been Son of God, the rise of Romulus; Son of God, the adventures of Hercules; Son of God, Bacchus edition; and Son of God, the Osiris Chronicles, and half a dozen more. We're pretty sure none of those guys existed at all. So when we hear about one more of those guys, but then his followers insist, "Oh, no, our resurrected Savior, our resurrected Son of God, he really existed," on it. In this spin-off, Son of God, JC, we hear about a sanctimonious Jew named Jesus, which very suspiciously means Savior, who has an amazing birth and goes around teaching people all the crazy things they have to do, or else invisible armies will soon descend from outer space and kill them all. And this pisses off everybody in charge, so the Jews haul him in and somehow manage to convince the local Roman police chief, Pontius Pilate, to have this guy executed for some inadequately explored reason. Then his body disappears from his grave, and he comes back with further instructions on how to avoid the coming space armies. That's actually the gist of the story. But there's all kinds of crazy, weird stuff in it. Like, for example, and I think this was mentioned earlier today, a star that floats around the Middle East and hovers over a barn in Bethlehem. But no one notices this star except some Iranian dudes with a mysterious wad of disposable cash and nothing better to do but follow weird stars around. For months on end, by the way, they walked all the way from Iran to Israel. So you got to be really hard up about this frickin' star. No one also seems to bother asking why this star didn't melt the Earth. I guess it was a cool star. And no one asks why only 3 Iranian guys could see it. I mean, we could speculate, I suppose, that they had some really good reefer over there. Not only were there wandering stars grazing the earth that no one else in the world could see when Jesus was born, the Gospels also claim when Jesus died, the sun went out for 3 whole hours, casting the entire earth into darkness in the middle of the day, which somehow no one else noticed either. I mean, if the sun went out for 3 hours, I think someone would have made a record of that. Quite a lot of people, really. I mean, even the Chinese would be freaking out. No one anywhere noticed the sun going out. So let's be honest. If the gospel authors could get away with making that up, they could have gotten away with making anything up. It's a lot easier to get away with inventing a man than the dissolving of the sun. And this is from the Gospel of Mark, after Jesus is buried, just abbreviating, paraphrasing here. Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of Jacob, and Salome came very early to the tomb as the sun was rising, and they were saying among themselves, "Oh wait, what are we, retarded? Who's going to roll that big freaking stone away from the door from the tomb for us?" And when they were scolding each other for their stupidity and started playing rock, paper, scissors to decide who gets to walk all the damn way back to town and get a big strong man to help them, because heaven knows 3 women can't push over a rock, suddenly they looked up and they saw the stone had already been rolled back. Very convenient. And when they went inside the tomb, they saw a young lad sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Don't be amazed. You seek Jesus the Nazarene, the crucified. He is risen. He isn't here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples, he has gone before you into Galilee. There you shall see him, just like he told you." And then all the women freaked out and ran away. Of course, if any of this had really happened, the first thing the women would have actually said, and I'm using modern vernacular, they would have in the ancient vernacular, but you get the point. They would have actually said, "Who the fuck are you?" Little introduction, maybe? And by the way, do you always crawl around in graves and talk to strange women you've never met? Young man? But that's reality, and this is a gospel. But now let's look at what the Gospel of Matthew says happened. Now, first of all, I have to mention this little detail. Matthew says there were a bunch of guards guarding the tomb. No one told Mark that. There are no guards in his version of the story. So now I quote Matthew's version of the same story. And this I'm going to quote verbatim. "As it began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His appearance was as lightning, and his gown white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards shook and became as dead men. And responding to this, the angel said to the women, 'Don't be afraid, for I know you seek the crucified Jesus, and he isn't here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see where the place where the Lord lay. Go quickly, tell his disciples he is risen from the dead. And lo, he is going before you into Galilee. There you shall see him. This I tell you.'" Okay, obviously the same story, except now in Matthew, the young boy sitting inside the tomb has become a flying death ray shooting angel descending from heaven, shining like snow and lightning, causing a massive earthquake, and magically paralyzing a bunch of guards that Mark had no idea were ever there. So, now be honest. Whose story would you consider true? Would you really try to invent some wild hypothesis to reconcile the two stories? Or would you just arrive at the obvious conclusion that Martha is full of shit? Okay, so the Gospels are hardly what we'd consider reliable documents. What else is in the New Testament? Well, the book of Revelation, a 5-hour-long acid trip so bizarre, it's basically the rambling diary of a guy who has an hours-long conversation with the dead spirit of Jesus, who appears in the form of a fucked-up mutant that makes John Carpenter's The Thing look cuddly. And this dead mutant Jesus even dictates letters from beyond the grave. I mean, that's the kind of sources these guys were using. Anyway, if you haven't read Revelation, trust me, it's that fucked up.
I had a question. Why do you think that since Luke obviously wrote Luke, why didn't he just feel free to splice in some historicity details in the speeches?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially because we have a lot of evidence that Luke is a very good fiction writer. There's 2 authors. One is Richard Purvo wrote a book called The Mystery of Acts. It's a short book. It's brilliant. I highly recommend it. By the time you finish it, you're going to say, Acts is such full of shit. It's really a good presentation of how Acts is complete fiction. Thomas Brodie has a thing called The Birthing of the New Testament, where he does the same thing on Luke, where it pretty much is a conclusive demonstration that Luke is writing fiction, and brilliant fiction at that. I mean, it's very skillful and very impressive. So you would normally think a really good fiction writer like that would tell the story correctly. I mean, if you're making up this, let's assume Acts is completely made up. This is one thing where I might disagree with Richard Purvo. If it's completely made up, why isn't Luke making the trial stories the way they should be, according to the way he set up the plot, right? Suddenly, it's as if he's forgotten his own plot. Now, there are certain other things about Luke, like at one point, a few points, he suddenly goes from third to first person for no reason, without any explanation, and then switches back again. There are certain things that are just weird about the construction of Luke, that it looks like he was trying to hastily work with different documents, and he probably had some previous document. We know he was using previous documents for the Gospels and Acts up to Acts 15 for some of it. Thomas Brodie shows this, that there was some lost gospel some sort of King's Gospel where Jesus is basically a retelling of the Elijah-Elisha story, where everything that Jesus does and says is basically the Elijah-Elisha story in 1 and 2 Kings, just rewritten for Jesus. He shows that if that structure is in there. That's one of the sources that Luke must have used, and his case is really